Hello, and welcome to a video about solving a system using an augmented matrix. This is a different way of solving systems of equations. It's a little fun, a little interesting, and you get to apply some of the same skills that you use for substitution and elimination in an almost different way. So first, we're going to work off this example, so you might want to go ahead and write that down. The first thing you're going to do is use your coefficients to create an augmented matrix. Now, this is different than a matrix equation, so be careful. Oh, I am going to show you how to do this by hand and using your graphing calculator. Just make sure that you're kind of comfortable doing both. So first, you're going to use these to create the first part of your matrix, the 3 by 3 portion of your matrix. So it goes 1, -1, 1. Then we usually draw a dotted line just for our own personal reference. And then 0. This is kind of indicating the coefficients over here. And then your answers, or your right side of the equation, over here. And then we have -1, 2, and -3. And then -5 is over here. And then we have +2, -3, and 5. And we end with 8. So this is our augmented matrix. We take all of the coefficients and then the numbers on the right-hand side, the constant numbers on the right-hand side, and we create this. Now, our goal is to end in what is called reduced row echelon form. Now, reduced row echelon forms, we have the identity matrix over here on the left, and then we have coefficients on the right. And those coefficients are actually our x, y, and z variables. So this is what we're going for. To do this, we have a couple different operations that we can do. We have a few things we're allowed to do. Your goal is to create zeros and ones. To create a 1, whoops. To create a 1, you can divide the entire row by whatever number is appropriate. To create a 0, that part's a little bit harder. You can add rows or multiply, and in adding rows, you can also multiply by a scalar. And it helps to kind of show your work as you go. And I'll show you how I do it. If you look up other videos on YouTube, I'm sure there are much smarter people out there in the universe who maybe can find a more efficient way to do this. But I'm just going to write my matrix down again. Then I have -1, 2, -3, -5. Oops, made it too short. And then I have 2, -3, 5, and 8. So again, to create a 1, you can divide the entire row. That's easy. And then to create a 0, you can add rows and multiply by a scalar. Now what I do when I do this is I usually work my way down the column. First trying to get a 1 in this position and then working zeros here. Then trying to get these zeros and getting that 1. Trying to get this 0. And then working my way back up to get these. Okay? So starting in your first position, that's already a 1, so you're super cool. So now I'm going to focus here, and I want that number to become a 0. Well, if I add, this is row, we'll call this row 1, row 2, and row 3. So if I add row 1 and row 2, that will make this number become a 0. So I'm going to do that. Row 1 doesn't change. I am adding row 1 and row 2 together to change row 2. So when I add row 1 and row 2 together, I have 1 plus -1, which is 0, which is what I wanted. Then I have -1 plus 2, which is 1. Whoops. Then I have 1 plus -3, which is -2. And then I have 0 plus -5, which is -5. And then I'll keep this one in red. The third row, I didn't do anything with the third row yet, so it's staying the same. Now, again, I'm working my way down, so now I'm going to focus on the 2. Now, I can't do anything with my blue 0 here, so I'm going to go all the way back up to the top. If I take row 1 and I multiply it by -2, and then add that to row 3, this 2 will then become a 0. So I have to do that mental math to everything. So again, I'm multiplying the top row by -2. So -2 times 1 plus 2 is 0. So this is now a 0. Then I have -2 times -1, which is +2, plus -3, which is now -1. Then I have -2 times 1, which is -2, plus 5, which is +3. And then I have -2 times 0, which is 0 plus 8, so that stays 0. Okay, now I'm going to scoot over to the next spot. I want this -1 to become a 0. To make that -1 become a 0, there's a lot of different ways I could do it, but since the row right above it has a 0 and a 0, if I work on those two, I can get another 0 to happen. So, and since this is +1 and -1, well, if I add them, I'm going to cancel them out. So if I just take row 2 plus row 3, I will get a 0 in that position, which is what I'm going for. See if I can squeeze this in. You'll find when you do this that you end up writing down the same thing over and over again. So it's very important to make sure that you don't mess up when you write things down. I'll change the color here so we realize. So that's 0. And then I'm just adding these two together. 1 plus -1 is 0, which is great. 2 plus 3 is 1. Oh, that's great. And then -5 plus 8 is +3. Wasn't that wonderful? This magically became a 1. It won't always happen that way. Like if this was a 4 or something like that, you could then just divide this whole row by 4. Okay, now I want to work my way back up. Now I want to work my way back up. So I'm going to focus now on this -2 and trying to make that -2 become a 0. Again, since this row below it has a 0 and a 0, trying to combine these two rows together again makes life a little easier. So I'm going to say if I multiply I'm going to come down here to my next line here. If I multiply 2 by row 3 and then add it to row 2, I should get a 0 because -2 times +1. So the top row still has not changed. The top row really doesn't ever change until the very end. So you have 1, -1, 1, 0, 0, 1. Oops, this is the row I'm changing. Let's keep that one in the same color. And then we've got 0, 0, 1, and 3. So I'm going to multiply this by 2, multiply that by 2, and then add it. So this row, the 0 stayed the same. The 1 is going to stay the same because 2 times 0 plus 1 is still 0. And then 2 times 1 plus -2, that's 0. And then I have 2 times 3, which is 6. And -5 plus 6 is 1. Cool. So now I'm working my way back up to the next row. I'm going to focus on this one. I want that to become a 0. Conveniently, if I just add those two rows together, I'll get another 0. So I'm going to say row 2 plus row 1. And here we go again. Row 2 this time isn't going to change because it's great. And row 3 I'm not touching anymore, so that's going to stay the same. So now I'm just going to add. So 1 plus 0 stays 1. -1 plus 1, that's 0, which is great. 1 plus 0 is 1. And 0 plus 1 is 1. Right, almost finished. One more step. And again, I can combine any two rows I want, but since I'm trying to change this number to make it become a 0, if I focus on the bottom row using row 3, since it already has 2 zeros in it, it's not going to change this number or this number. You're trying to create as little work as possible. So if I take -1 and multiply it by row 3, and then add that to row 1, I should get my final matrix. So again, the middle row isn't changing, it's perfect. The bottom row isn't changing, it's also perfect. So now I'm going to take this and multiply this by -1, and this by -1, and then add it up here to row 1. It's become 0 and 1, and then 0, because -1 times 1 plus 1 is 0. And then -1 times 3 is -3 plus 1. Or 1 minus -3 is -2. You always want to be careful on this. You technically don't subtract in this process, so you always want to make sure you're paying attention to which thing has to become negative to then add it onto the other one. You wouldn't want to multiply row 1 by -1 because then you would have to change all the signs of row 1, and you would have to then change more things in it. So this is your reduced row echelon form, and your answers to x, y, and z. X is -2, y is 1, and z is 3, because that's your reduced row echelon form. Now, when you're doing reduced row echelon form, there's a couple different things I want to make you aware of. You can do this in your calculator, and that's what I want to talk about next. So let's go back to the top, and I'll show you how to put in this matrix and do the reduced row echelon in your calculator. So you're going to go to the second matrix menu. Whoops, second matrix. You're going to go over to edit. You can edit any one you want. I'll just edit the first one. You need to change the dimensions. This is a 3 by 4. And just like before, slide this over a little bit. Just like before, you want to punch in